There is a moment, just before dawn, in a 14th century English castle that most people have never imagined. Not the feasts, not the trumpets, just a woman in a cold stone room, still half asleep, watched by 4 other women she did not choose, doing something she cannot do alone, getting dressed. It is around 1350. The castle is Windsor. The woman is Philippa of Hainaut, Queen of England, wife of Edward III, mother of 12 children. And the first thing she does upon waking is not pray, not eat, and not speak. It is something far more immediate. Somewhere beneath the heavy woolen bed curtains, on the floor beside the bed, sits a ceramic vessel, round-bottomed, handled, cold to the touch. This is the chamber pot, and it has been there all night. Even for a queen, the morning begins here. The chamber pot was not considered shameful, and it was simply furniture. Every room of every castle had one, from the king's private solar to the servants' sleeping quarters. Nobles and royals kept chamber pots because the garderobe, the stone latrine built into the castle wall, was often at the end of a corridor through a drafty passage in a recess barely wide enough to turn around in. At night, in winter, in a long gown, with candles guttering in the wind, no one walked that far. The pot was brought to you. When you were done, a lady-in-waiting or chambermaid removed it. That was her duty. It was also, strangely, a position of trust. No one remarks on this now. But for Philippa, it was simply the beginning of every single day. Once the chamber pot was removed and a basin of water brought in, warmed if the household was running smoothly, and stone cold if it was not, the dressing began. And here is where the reality of a medieval queen's body becomes most visible and most misunderstood. The first garment placed against Philippa's skin was a chemise or shift, a long, loose tunic of linen, woven fine enough to sit comfortably against the body. Linen was the one fabric that could be washed regularly without destroying it. This was deliberate. This was not accidental hygiene. The chemise was washed. The chemise was bleached in the sun to keep it white. The chemise was the layer that touched her skin, and it was the layer that could be cleaned. What could not be cleaned so easily were the garments placed on top. Over the chemise came the kirtle, a fitted floor-length gown, laced tightly at the back or side, usually made of fine wool. Over the kirtle came another gown, and heavier and more formal, a cote-hardie with long sleeves that reached to the knuckles, or a surcoat with wide openings at the sides. Over that, depending on the occasion, might come a fur-lined mantle, a velvet overdress, or one of the elaborate embroidered robes that appeared in Philippa's wardrobe accounts. One documented robe was purple velvet, embroidered with golden squirrels, made for a churching ceremony after one of her many births. These outer garments were expensive enough to be repaired rather than replaced. Records from Isabella of France, queen to Edward II, Philippa's predecessor by one generation, show that her exchequer accounts list payments to have the worn hems of her gowns replaced, not the gowns themselves. The gowns were not washed. To wash them was to risk destroying the fabric, the color, and the delicate embroidery, and so they were worn day after day, season after season, until the hems wore out and were patched. Think about that for a moment. Garments worn against the outer body, never washed, layered over a body that bathed infrequently, in a castle where warmth was produced by fire and bodies. The smell was not what we would now call clean, but it was not considered unclean either. The medieval nose was simply calibrated differently. When everyone around you smells the same, it is not remarkable. And yet, something was done about it. Dried herbs were tucked into the folds of gowns. Lavender, rosemary, and wormwood were hung in wardrobes, partly for fragrance, and partly, extraordinarily, because the ammonia rising from the latrine shaft nearby was believed to kill the lice that lived in fabric. The word garderobe itself, the word for the castle toilet, literally means to guard the robes. Clothes were stored near the latrine on purpose. The smell that repelled was also, in their understanding, the smell that preserved. The layers of Philippa's dress took time. Her ladies arranged the sleeves, secured the lacing, settled the heavy skirts. By the time she was dressed, she was carrying several kilograms of fabric, and she had not yet left the room. For a woman at the center of a medieval royal court in 1350, the body was not private in the way we understand privacy now. It was managed, observed, and interpreted. Philippa bore 12 children for Edward III, 12 full-term pregnancies over the course of their marriage, beginning when she was approximately 15 years old. Each birth was managed by midwives in a sealed and darkened room, a lying-in chamber from which men were excluded. The windows were covered, fires kept burning even in summer to shield both mother and newborn from what was believed to be dangerous outside air. After each birth, a queen was expected to rest for a month before undergoing churching, the ritual purification ceremony of the church, after which she could re-enter public life. Until then, she was considered spiritually impure, her body in a liminal state between the sacred duty of reproduction and the formal world of the court. Menstruation was managed with even less comfort and rather more secrecy. Cloth rags, strips of linen folded and tucked into place, were the only available means. Wealthier women wore red petticoats during their monthly courses, aimed partly for warmth and partly to conceal staining. There was no underwear in the modern sense for most of the medieval period. The shift was the innermost garment, and the rags were held against the body with a girdle or belt. Later evidence from the court of Elizabeth I of England describes the queen owning 3 black silk girdles, specifically to keep her linen sanitary cloths in place. The same practical need existed for Philippa 2 centuries earlier, met in essentially the same way. Menstruation in the 14th century was not simply a hygiene challenge. It was a theological condition. The Church, drawing on centuries of interpretation, associated menstrual blood with impurity, with Eve's original sin, with the female body as fundamentally suspect. Medical theory, still grounded in the ancient humoral system of Galen and Hippocrates, described women's bodies as wetter and colder than men's, their blood less perfectly refined, their purging therefore monthly and necessary. To menstruate was to be in a particular state of spiritual and physical vulnerability, to be a queen, to hold enormous public power, and to carry this private biological reality simultaneously. That tension ran through every week of a medieval woman's adult life. The bathing that did occur was ceremonial rather than routine. Great households maintained wooden tubs that were carried into chambers and filled with heated water by servants. The process was slow, labor-intensive, and required planning. Scented oils, sponges, and herbs were used. For Philippa, a bathing after childbirth was likely the most regular occasion. The washing of the body before churching had both hygienic and spiritual dimensions. But weekly bathing as a habit, the way we understand it now, was not the rhythm of her life. Hands were washed before meals. This was expected even of the highest nobility, a gesture of respect as well as cleanliness. Faces and hands were rinsed in the morning. Feet were washed in the evening as a remedy for cold and exhaustion. The rest was managed with linen, herbs, and the patient acceptance that the body was what it was. What is striking, looking back from this distance, is not how dirty this world was, but how much effort was made within its limits. Laundry was a massive undertaking. Chemises and shifts were beaten, boiled, scrubbed against boards with lye made from wood ash, then spread to bleach in the sun. Clothing was aired daily. Overcloaks were hung out of windows. People carried small bundles of sweet herbs, called nosegays, around their necks or at their waists, and this was not vanity. It was the medieval equivalent of deodorant, and everyone from merchant wives to queens used them. In 1350, Philippa was in her late 30s. The Black Death had arrived in England 2 years earlier, carried on ships from the continent. It killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population in its first wave. Among the dead were several of her own children. The disease changed everything: the labor market, the church's authority, the price of food, the nature of fear. It also changed the way bodies and cleanliness were thought about. Medieval physicians, observing the plague's devastation, One believed that the disease spread through miasma, bad air, corrupted by rot, stench, and accumulated filth. This was not correct in its mechanism, but it was not entirely wrong in its observation. Crowded, dirty environments did accelerate the spread. And so, the court's concern with smell and cleanliness was not merely social preference. It was a matter of survival, as understood at the time. For Philippa, the year 1350 was spent at royal residences moving between Windsor, Westminster, and Woodstock. Edward's court was known for its extravagance. The Order of the Garter had just been founded 2 years earlier, with its elaborate tournaments and ceremonies. At these public events, a queen's dress was not merely clothing. It was political communication. Every fabric, every color, every fur lining spoke of wealth, power, and legitimacy. Or Philippa's accounts describe robes made from green cloth of Brussels, cameline wool, Sindan from Tripoli, richly furred with miniver, the prized white and gray squirrel fur that lined medieval nobles' mantles and appeared in countless illuminated manuscripts in softly striped bands. For the Feast of Pentecost alone in a single year, her tailor received enough fabric for 5 separate robes. These robes, worn in public, were clean in appearance. They were frequently replaced as colors faded. Natural dyes in this period faded quickly, and to appear in a gown whose color had dulled was to appear in old clothes, which was socially unacceptable for royalty. The outer performance of cleanliness and freshness was actively maintained. But underneath those vivid robes, under the layered kirtles and the chemise, or was a body living according to its centuries' relationship with water, waste, and the limits of what was possible. Between grand ceremonies, behind closed chamber doors, the same chamber pot waited, the same cold stone floor, the same ritual of dressing and undressing, managed by the same small group of women who were themselves bound to court service, paid in cloth and proximity to power, entrusted with the most intimate knowledge of the queen's body. These ladies-in-waiting were not decorative. They were essential. They handled the queen's money, carried her crowns, dressed her for every public appearance, and managed the private realities that the public was never meant to see. Philippa of Hainault died in August 1369 at Windsor Castle of an illness described as similar to dropsy, a painful accumulation of fluid in the body. She was in her mid-50s. Of her 12 children, most had already died. She had outlived the Black Death's first wave, survived years of military campaigns alongside her husband, managed the regency of England in his absence, and knelt in the mud before him at Calais to beg mercy for 6 condemned men. Jean Froissart, the chronicler who knew her personally, described her as the most gentle, the most liberal, and the most courteous queen of her days. Her alabaster effigy in Westminster Abbey shows a woman with a full, kind face, heavy-lidded, serene. She is wearing carved robes of extraordinary detail, the stone folds mimicking the weight of real fabric. She looks permanent. She looks clean. The reality of her daily life looked different, and this is worth sitting with. And because the distance between the effigy and the chamber pot, between the carved queen in Westminster Abbey and the woman crouching in cold candlelight before dawn, is not a distance of centuries alone. It is the distance between what history chooses to record and what it does not. It is the distance between the queen as public symbol and the woman as living body. What Philippa's daily reality teaches us is something about the nature of dignity itself. Dignity in 1350 was not about hygiene in the way we understand it. It was about bearing, about performing the expected roles with grace under enormous physical, political, and personal pressure, about carrying 12 pregnancies, managing a court, acting as regent, and appearing in public in vivid, perfectly furred robes while privately relying on cloth rags, cold water, and women who asked nothing but were trusted with everything. The systems we take for granted, private bathrooms, running water, disposable sanitary products, deodorant, laundry machines, are not ancient. They are shockingly recent. The world Philippa inhabited was not a simplified version of ours. It was a fully complete world, with its own logic, its own solutions, its own hierarchy of what mattered. In that world, the outer garment was more important than the inner body. The ceremony was more important than the bath. The public self was what endured. What has changed since 1350 is the infrastructure. What has not changed is something quieter: the labor of the body, the management of its needs, and the fact that this labor has so often been invisible, carried out by women for women, unnamed in chronicles, or unrecorded in official histories, and yet absolutely constant. Every queen who ever dressed for a feast began, that morning, exactly the same way. The crown was visible. Everything underneath it was not. If you've made it this far, thank you for traveling back with me to 1350. Now tell me, what place and time would you like to see reconstructed next? Leave your suggestion in the comments below. Every story waiting to be told begins with someone asking the question,